Hey everyone, this is Tim from ArcanaNetworks. I'm going to be doing a full setup of MEVO starting from download all the way to provisioning the router. My hope with this video is that those of you who have never used MEVO before can follow this video exactly, and you'll have a Dmvpn environment up and running I think this will probably take us about an hour. So I'm going to log into our download site with my client-facing account. So you should get a view very similar to this. Go ahead and find the latest version of MEVO available for you to download. You'll notice there's two different types. There's one that says for new installations and one that says for upgrades. The difference between the two is the one that says new installations has SQL Express bundled with it. MEVO requires a SQL database in order for it to work. So for fancy environments, some people like to have their SQL servers on a completely different VM, but if you're setting this up, say, in your lab or as a proof of concept, we bundle SQL Express with the MEVO installer in that new installations folder so that you can essentially just plug and play. Once it's downloaded, go ahead and extract the contents. And once you've extracted the contents, inside you'll find something called a setup.exe. Right-click that, run it as administrator. Now, the installation process is fairly simple. Really, all we're going to be doing is clicking next through the prompts. So I'll probably speed up this video as we go through the installation, just so we don't have to wait for the full thing to finish. I will slow down and pause whenever we do reach a point that I need to explain a little bit more of. As far as what the installer is actually installing, there's three big components. There's IIS, which is essentially the web server, because we will be configuring MEVO through essentially Chrome or Edge or your browser of choice. We will also be installing the SQL Express, as I mentioned, and we'll be installing the MEVO server itself. As far as other components that you'll need for your Dmvpn MEVO environment, you'll need an SDPCA router and a Dmvpn hub router. Now, if you're doing this in a lab or as a proof of concept, you can actually combine the Dmvpn functionality on the same router that's doing your SDPCA functionality. We don't really recommend this for production environments because, say, if you have to troubleshoot one component of it, such as the certificate authority or the SDP part or the hub part, and you might need to reload the router during your troubleshooting process, you really wouldn't want to have to touch the hub part of it because, well, all your spokes are going to be connected to that hub. So in a production environment, keep them separate. But again, if you're doing this in a lab, you can go ahead and combine the two. Now, what I'm using in this environment is I'm using a pair of CSRs. These are essentially Cisco routers that are VMs. So these are virtual routers. And you'll notice the configuration I've tried to keep as clean as possible. There's really nothing on here except for the IP addressing and basic routing in order for it to reach all the parts of my lab network. The one thing that I really want to show though is we do put this thing called a VRF, a virtual route forwarding table, called outside on your WAN interface. So you'll notice under GI1 of both the SDP router and the hub router, we've configured that outside VRF. If you want to follow this video exact, you will need to have this configured on your router as well, because our MEVO templates, which will configure the rest of the SDPCA and hub functionality on the CSRs, do expect that there is something called an outside VRF located on your outside interfaces. So go ahead and get that configured if you haven't already. When we go back to MEVO and the installation, one thing we do recommend is you have everything installed on different disk drives. So here we are specifying some installation paths for your SQL. So I'm just putting those on E and F. When it asks me later where I'm going to install MEVO, I'm just going to put that on the C drive. We'll probably just let the video speed up here and finish the rest of the installation. There's not too much more to talk about. Okay, so it looks like our installation has just about finished because the last thing it will ask you to do is to restart your computer. So we'll go ahead and say finish or yes and let this thing reload. Once it's back, you should be able to open up a web browser. And then you can navigate to the IP address or the fully qualified domain name of your MEVO server. Type in /MEVO to the end of it and hit enter. And that should take you to the MEVO login page. So let's log in and let's start configuring this guy. We'll start off by going to the configuration global variables page, and we'll fill out the information here. So domain name, DNS address. The credentials here are the credentials you want to use to log into your spoke router after it's been provisioned. So once the tunnels are up, if you want to log in with admin password 123, that's what you would type in here. Give it an NTP address, and everything else you can pretty much leave with its default values. Next, go to configuration headings, and we will add those two CSR routers I was mentioning earlier. So first, the SDP router. I'm going to select my device type, put in the inside address and the outside address of that router. Then I'm going to click on the details button and provide the credentials to SSH to that router. Once I'm done, click save, and MEVO will try to SSH to that device. Okay, we're going to do the same exact thing, except this time we're going to add a Dmvpn Cloud. So this is going to be my second CSR router. And then the last thing we'll do is we will add our Pki AAA server. So I'm using ICE version 2.2 in the lab. And one thing I should mention is my ICE server has already been configured. I'm simply pointing MEVO to it by putting in the REST API ERS admin account details here. If you want full details on what the REST API is, what the ERS admin account is, how to configure ICE to make it work with your MEVO, we do have a document that covers all of it, so please contact us and we'll send that document over to you. Otherwise, for the scope of this video, I'm not really going to cover it because it's already been done. Okay, so what we've done so far is we've added our three major components, the SDP router, the Dmvpn router, and our Pki AAA server, in this case ICE 2.2. We've added those three things to MEVO, and we've verified that MEVO can reach all of them. Next, we need to start actually configuring these devices. So the ICE server, we don't use MEVO to configure. That has to be done manually. Again, we have that document. So what we're going to do is we're going to run an inventory on the ICE server to essentially grab the relevant parts of that configuration that we did that MEVO requires in order for us to set the rest of our parameters. Because what MEVO is going to use ICE for is essentially just create and delete accounts, and we need to point MEVO to the right folders, essentially, so that it knows where and how to create and delete those accounts from. So once the inventory finishes, we will open up the details for our Pki AAA server, and there are a few things we need to configure. The server ports, you need to give it your server key, so the pre-shared key that's going to be shared for essentially TACACS, radius, those sorts of things. Next, you'll want to create your Pki AAA device account. This is essentially the two-factor authorization that we use for our Dmvpn environment. I have an identity group configured in ICE called MEVO-users. You probably have something very similar if you followed our documentation. So go ahead and select that one here. The other thing that we're going to select is enable one-time password. This means that when you go to provision your account, MEVO will create that provisioning account in ICE with a randomly generated password for you to use, and we'll set an expiry date, and we'll also mark MEVO to automatically delete this account after the account has been provisioned. So just some little extra security while we're doing this. So that takes care of everything we need to do with ICE for the time being. So now we'll go in order. So we'll go back to our SDP router and open up the details for that. Here, we need to configure the CA authority port. Our default is 8000. You can leave that the same. Certificate authority fingerprint, you can leave as blank. We will need to inventory that once the router has been configured. Put in your inside IP address. Fill out these informational details. So organizational unit, organization, location. That is all things that will be configured for your certificate authority. So when you read the certificates, you know where it came from. Provisioning mode can be done as self or warehouse. If you're following this video and following our ICE documentation guide without us helping you, just leave it as self. The difference between these two are the types of accounts that you can use when provisioning the router. Essentially, when you use self mode, you are going to log in with your MEVO account to provision the router. If you're doing warehouse, you will log in with an admin account, and once you're logged in with your admin account, you will select which MEVO account you want to provision. So that one will be useful for production environments where, say, a technician will be provisioning the router on behalf of the client, and then you'll be shipping out the router to your client or to the end location. Pki mode can be CS or RA. Again, if you're following the video, leave it as CS. We do support remote authorities, so things like a Microsoft NDES server. For EC environments, we support the ISC cert agent, but that is a little bit more advanced than what we'll be doing here. Certificate authority password. Just give this some password and write it down, put it in your password vault, memorize it. You will need this password if something ever happens to your SDP router and you need to do a disaster recovery of your certificate authority. Other than that, it can be whatever password that you want to use. And then your SDP inside interface. Then scroll back to the top, hit that save button, and we are done with the SDP. Next, we'll go to Dmvpn Cloud. We need your tunnel network address. So this will be all the IP addresses that determines the interface of your tunnel interface on your router. So it'll be tunnel interface 0 will have IP addresses from this range. Now, this network is very, very difficult to edit later on without avoiding any type of downtime for your DMVPN network. So the best advice we can give you is make this something large. Make it as future-proof as possible, because if you start running out of these IP addresses and need to expand it, there's really no clean way to do it. In my lab, I'm only going to use a /24, but I recommend you use something very, very big for this network here. Your tunnel number is going to be the tunnel interface number configured on your device. So interface tunnel 0, tunnel 128, tunnel 4000, whatever you want to use. Give it a tunnel key. Now, the bandwidth and delay are informational parameters. EIGRP will use these parameters to determine the best path. They don't actually affect anything related to actual throughput. The source interface of your hub router will go in here. We can put in the NHRP details, so similar to the tunnel key. This is just the information that you want to use for your tunnel network. The EIGRP settings are mostly your security encryption type settings. You can just follow along what's in the video for our recommended standard of security. And then the routing, we do use EIGRP as mentioned earlier. So fill out your AS number and your named EIGRP, the name of the EIGRP that you want to use. I'm going to uncheck performance monitor since I won't be using that in this video, and then I'm going to go to the top and hit save. Okay, one more field we need to do. We edited the Dmvpn Cloud. We need to go to the actual gateway router, open the details for that, and put in the tunnel IP address you want that device to have. For most cases, this is probably just going to be the first available address in your network, so .1. Okay, so now that everything's configured in MEVO, let's actually get that configuration over to the devices. So I'm going to select the SDP router, go to More Actions, Operations, Deploy, and here I'm going to select the default SDP template that comes stock with MEVO. Remember, this should all work as long as your router is clean and has that outside VRF. You'll have to select it one more time and then hit OK. You can actually click on the details button and that will show you a preview of the configuration that will be pushed to your device. So just keep hitting next until it starts pushing. And we should see MEVO complete. And actually it looks like I got a failure message, fingerprint not found. So let's do some quick troubleshooting. I'm going to pop open my SSH session to that router. And what I'm going to do is I will do a show crypto PKI server to see what's going on. And it looks like my CA never got enabled because my time is not set. So another thing that is important to mention that I forgot to check earlier, make sure your clock is synced. So let me go ahead and configure my NTP services on this router, and we'll fast forward once I am done. Okay, so I've got my clock synced, and now when I do my show crypto PKI server, we can see that the certificate server is enabled, and now that field CA cert fingerprint has now been populated. So let's pop back into MEVO, and I will select the SDP registrar, and I'm going to inventory that. The trust point name I can grab off of the router. It's that CVO-CS. We'll hit next and wait for this to finish. And if I pop open the details for my SDP router, that certificate authority fingerprint field has now been populated. Okay, we will do basically the same exact thing for the Dmvpn. So I will select the device, go to More Actions, Operations, Deploy, select the default stock template, and click next to the prompts. And this one will deploy successfully. I'm actually going to verify the configuration real quick on my hub router. So this is something you can do as well as you follow along. So in my hub router, I also need to get my clock synced because that is not something that I had done for my pair of lab routers. I can see from a show IP int brief that the tunnel has been configured. The big thing that I want to check is to make sure that my hub router has gotten the certificate from my SDPCA router. So I'm going to put in a show crypto PKI certificate verbose, and I'm going to make sure that I've got that CVO-PKI certificate. That is the default name we use for the trust point in our template for that SDP router. So once I've verified it's there, I will give a write mem. MEVO should have done this automatically for me, but because I touched the clock and did some other things, I will just do it manually here as well. So that takes care of our headend setup. Next in MEVO, let's go to configuration subnet blocks. So what we'll configure on this page is the LAN IP addresses that are going to be configured on our spoke routers. So if you want your users to get something like a 192.168, this is where it goes. So I'm going to give it a name, I'm going to give it a description, LAN type leave as default, network address. So this is the big block of IP addresses that MEVO will hand out to your spoke routers. Now, the tricky thing here is the subnet and the LAN subnet mask, these two fields. What do? Well, the way I like to think about this is I like to think of it as ordering a pizza. So I'm having MEVO I'm ordering from MEVO a /24, a 24-inch pizza. So 172.233, that's my pepperoni pizza. And I'm getting it of size /24. So I'm getting a 24-inch pizza. Now, from that 24-inch pizza, how many slices do I want? I want a /28 number of slices. So that's what those two different LAN subnets do. One of them says, hey MEVO, these are the IP addresses that you're allowed to assign to the spoke routers. The LAN subnet mask says, this is how big of a subnet should ultimately end up to each individual spoke router. So this is how big each slice of the pizza each spoke router is going to get. So once I've configured that, I'll hit save. And if you notice on this page under the status, you'll see MEVO has done the math for us. So /28 out of a /24, that gives me 16 slices of my /24 pizza. Okay, so now that this is done, let's verify our templates. So configuration template, and let's find our device types, the type of device that we are provisioning. I'm going to do a 4-port. And what you're looking for here is a base template, a Dmvpn template, a firewall template, QoS, EEM, and factory configuration. These should all be marked as active by default, unless you're using a device type that wasn't listed in the drop-down box. If that is the case, you'll need to do a little bit of exploring in MEVO on your own, but go ahead and pause the video because I'll put up the instructions here so that you can go and get your device added to that drop-down menu. And then once it's added on this page, make sure that each one of those template types is marked as active. Okay, now let's go to the classes page. So the classes page is essentially how we can create different types of MEVO users. So say you're going to have some users provisioning off an 11.11.4 port router, some users provisioning off an 8-port router. Some routers are going to have wireless, others won't have wireless. Some you only want to connect to your East Coast data center, some only to your West Coast data centers. Classes is where you configure all of it. We're going to keep things really, really simple, and we're just going to make one class, and we're just going to point that to the 4-port that I'm provisioning. We're pretty much going to leave everything as the defaults. I'm only going to select the teleworkers, the device type, make sure my LAN pools that I created are enabled. Everything else we will just leave as is. Once the class has been created, we can go to the groups page. This is where we start to make actual MEVO accounts. So I will create a teleworker because the class is for teleworkers. This will be my Tim video, my Tim Sandbox Lab video account. So I will create the name, password, and the email. Now remember, when we actually go to provision, we're not using the password here. We're going to be using the one-time password that MEVO generated when it creates that account for us in our ICE server. In fact, the only thing the password on this page is used for is if that Tim Sandbox video user ever needs to log into the MEVO GUI. But because they're just a teleworker that I'm managing, that I'm an administrator of, they're never going to need to touch this. They're not a networking person. So the password that I put in here can be anything. It doesn't really matter because that person is not an admin. They're never going to log into the MEVO webpage. So any password you want to give them, you can put it in when you're creating these accounts. One thing I did forget to cover in this video, now that I've created this account, is where do we set up our SMTP? Where do we set up our email servers? To do that, you can go to your configuration email page, and then on the left, if you click on SMTP server, there you can fill out the host name, IP address, the port, sender and receiver emails. So that's where you would do it here. I'm not going to be doing it for this video, but that's how you do it if you want to do it for your lab. So back on the groups page, I am ready now to select my account. Go to more actions, request, send request. I'm going to leave everything as the default except for upload speed. The upload speed is a QoS shaper value for your outbound traffic. So the best rule of thumb is to set this as close to the user's actual throughput speed, as their actual upload speed as you can. That will give them the best quality. If you don't know what it is, or if you can't, give it something large, because if you give them something too small, all you'll end up doing is throttling their traffic. Okay, so now I'll hit next, and MEVO now is building the configuration that is for my spoke router. Once the request status has changed to ready, I know that my router is, well, ready to provision. So in order to do that, I will click on the action buttons and I will go to request details. And here I can view my STP one-time password. Now, this password will also be sent to the email address I configured for this account, but because I didn't configure an email server for this demo video, I won't have it. So I'm just going to copy the password out of this page. Now, to provision the router, you need to have your machine connected via Ethernet cable to your spoke router. But before we even get there, let me show you a common error you might run into. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a new web browser and I'm going to point it to our provisioning URL. So the outside IP address of my STP router /easySTD/intro. And you'll notice I'm going to get this error that says ERR Ssl Bad Record. So basically the web browser doesn't like the SSL certificate being used on the STP router. To fix this, let's SSH to the STP router. I'm going to create a new RSA key. I'm going to call it outside, and I'm going to create a new trust point, also call it outside. I will point it to the RSA key that I just created, and the enrollment URL I'm going to point to itself because the certificate authority lives on my SDP router. So the enrollment URL will be the inside IP address with that default 8000 IP HTTP port that we configured earlier in MEVO. After that, to actually get the certificate, I need to do a crypto PKI auth outside and then a crypto PKI enroll outside. Give it any password that you want, and when you reach the prompt that says request a certificate, say yes. Now, in order to get the certificate, I need to grant it on the SDP router. So to view the certificate request, the command is show crypto PKI server, the server name, and then requests. But if you've been following along in this video and using MEVO to deploy your SDP router, there should be a built-in alias, and you can just type in requests, and that will do the same exact thing. Similarly, to grant the certificate, I'm just going to type in grant space 1 to grant the certificate for the certificate that I just requested. If I do a show crypto PKI timers, that will show me when I can expect to get the certificate on my router. So I see the polling time is 30 seconds. So while I'm waiting for those 30 seconds to pass, I'm going to go back into conft and type in IP HTTP secure trust point outside. So this is going to specify that certificate that I just created and bind that to be my SSL HTTP certificate. I'm going to wait a little bit longer for my router to get that certificate, and I'm going to verify it's there with our handy dandy show crypto PKI certificate command. So all these commands like the show crypto PKI timers, the show crypto PKI certificate verbose command, the auth and the enroll commands, those are all things that you're going to want to keep handy for troubleshooting any CA related things within your environment. Now that this is done, I'm going to write mem to save the cert, and then I'm going to give it a quick reload. And once we get back, we'll go provision the router. So I've swapped over to a different VM, and this one is connected to the router that I will be provisioning. And the way that I can verify this is in the command prompt, you'll see that I'm connected to a 10.10.10 network. So when you order a router from Cisco for Cisco Virtual Office, it comes with a default factory configuration. So normally when you order a router from Cisco, it comes completely blank. But if you order it specifically for CVO, it comes with a default factory configuration where you will get an IP address on the 10.10.10 network. And that configuration setup in the default should also get you internet access. If you do have a console cable handy, or if you SSH to the router, you should also see a banner saying it's ready for Cisco Virtual Office, and your hostname should simply be your name. Okay, to actually provision the router, we will follow the same steps we were doing earlier. So we will open up our web browser and point it to the outside IP address of our SDP /easysdd/intro. Here we'll supply it with the username and password provided by our one-time password. I'm going to try and copy and paste, but it looks like it doesn't want to paste through my session, so I will just have to type this in by hand. Once you've gotten into the provisioning page, which should look something like this, you are pretty much done. There will be a couple more prompts that you may have to click, such as the send anyway prompts. You will also get one more prompt telling you to sign in to 10.10.10.1. The credentials here will always be Cisco in all lowercase. 10.10.10.1 is the router that you're provisioning, as we verified by checking our IP config. And the default credentials to get into the router is Cisco. So that's what we're doing here. We'll get one more send anyway prompt that we need to click on, and now MEVO should be pushing that configuration to our router. Now, through the provisioning process, the SDP router is going to grab our RSA fingerprint off the spoke router, and it's going to pre-grant that certificate so that when my spoke router goes to request the certificate it needs to establish its Dmvpn tunnel, it will be able to get the certificate automatically. So Unlike when I was configuring that outside certificate for the SDP router, this is going to be completely automatic. There is nothing that I need to touch or do past this point in order for my router to get its configuration, to get its certificate, and for that DMVPN tunnel to come up. This is all kind of a special magic process that works through going to that easy std/intro URL. I've seen customers configure Grant Auto on their SDPCA configuration, thinking that they need that for the certificates to reach the spoke routers, but that is not required and is a huge security risk. Do not configure Grant Auto on your SDPCA router. If you provision the router through the easy std/intro provisioning process, the router knows how to get its certificate automatically without that command being configured, and it is very secure. With that, we can see on the console our certificate has been requested, it has been granted, we've received the certificate, and we have an EIGRP adjacency message. If we do a show DMVPN, we can see the tunnel is up. And with that, everything's done.